Hi, and welcome to another module in FSHN 101, and today we're going to be talking about cheeses. And you may recall the nursery rhyme, Little Miss Muffet, who sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. However, you may not know what curds and whey are. Simply put, they're products of cheese making. So when the enzyme rennet, or an acid, is added to milk, coagulation occurs, separating the solid and the liquid parts of the cheese. And you can see in this jar over on our image here that we've got the liquid whey at the bottom, and then we start to see the solid curds up at the top there. So those curdled lumps are very simply called curds, and the whey is that liquid byproduct. A little cheese history. Cheese production evidences back to the dates of the 7th and 6th millenniums BC. However, exact practices are unknown. So producing cheese involves the coagulation of milk, either enzymatically or with acid treatment, like we had mentioned before. And so we have these curds, and the curds have things like protein, such as casein, and milk fat that are going to be part of that solid portion. And then we have the water-soluble lactose with some other components that make up that liquid whey. And here you can see a picture of Swiss cheese. And you may wonder, how does Swiss cheese get their holes in them? And this is due to gas bubbles. So if you're referring to those holes in the Swiss cheese itself, they can be referred to as the eyes of the cheese. And if a cheese does not develop eyes, like a Swiss cheese that doesn't have the holes in them, it's actually called blind cheese, which is kind of interesting. Speaking of Swiss cheese, you may wonder some more about the Swiss cheese characteristics. So Swiss cheese is a white but slightly yellow color associated with it, and it has its characteristic Swiss cheese holes. Once the cheese is in the vat, we have the strain of bacteria that consume lactic acid, and that lactic acid was actually a product of the lactose fermentation earlier in the production. So we have this byproduct, which is bubbles of carbon dioxide gas. The bubbles become trapped in the rind of the cheese and slowly form these holes, or what we call the eyes. The Swiss cheese itself has a little bit of a pungent odor, and it has this flavor associated with that pungent odor. And with different types of Swiss cheese, some are going to have more of a strong flavor, others are going to be more mild. And some are going to be very easy to melt, and some may be more difficult to melt. So we have Emmental, which is a type of Swiss cheese which has this smooth melting and classic Swiss cheese that you might think of. Overall, Swiss cheese is sweet, mild, and has a nutty taste, and it's very creamy on the palate. Another famous cheese is cheddar cheese, and it is known for the fact that it's a good source of calcium like other cheeses, and it also is packed with vitamin K. Cheddar cheese has what we call a sharp flavor along with that pungency, and there's often a hint of earthy smell to it, and it should melt in the mouth. And the reason for this is because it has these peptides in it, and so the peptides give it that flavor, give it that sharp flavor, and also that pungent smell itself. It's going to be firm with texture, and it has this yellow-orange color. And most of the time, it has this annatto added to it to make it that classic yellow-orange color. But you can also find some cheddar cheese that is going to be lighter in color, almost this off-white color. Cheddar cheese has a very distinctive smell. If someone opens a bag of cheddar cheese, even with your eyes closed, you'll be able to smell it and tell what it is if you've had experience with it before. We also have an enzyme, lipase, which is a key contributor in making that cheddar cheese, because that lipase is going to break down the lipids that are often present in that milk itself. Blue cheese is very different in its characteristics than what you might think of as the cheddar or also the Swiss cheese. It has an extremely strong and very pungent aroma, and it has a very, again, sharp, distinct taste. It is typically white, but it has this mold which creates this blue veining look to it. It's going to be tangy and sharp as well, and it has really a salty flavor too. In fact, if you look at the nutrition facts panel, which we're going to showcase later in this PowerPoint video, you'll notice that that blue cheese is highest in sodium content per serving. Blue cheese is made from cow, goat, or sheep's milk that's been cured with hints of the penicillin mold, and it's safe for us to consume unless you have an allergy to that penicillin mold. Cottage cheese has its own very distinct characteristics. It looks soft and white, creamy, and it also is packed with nutrients. It's made from milk and an enzyme called rennet, which is going to trigger that coagulation. Like we mentioned earlier, you can also have an acid which triggers that coagulation as well. Curd sizes can vary between small, medium, or large. And in the picture that you might see on this slide, this is closer to a large curd with cottage cheese. It has a mild flavor, it's kind of creamy and salty with a very neutral smell. In fact, if you open cottage cheese with your eyes closed and you smell it, it might smell very similar to a glass of milk. It's a good source of phosphorus and protein in combination with the calcium, so it also is going to help promote good bone strength. So let's test your knowledge. What enzyme is cottage cheese made with? Is it rennet, pectinase, xylanase, cellulase, or esterase? If you said rennet, you are correct. So let's walk you through the making of cottage cheese. We have several simple ingredients, like a gallon of pasteurized skim milk, some vinegar, some salt, as well as half and half or heavy cream. The first thing we're going to do is use a large saucepan. Heat the milk to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, so make sure you have your thermometer. When the temperature is reached, remove it from the heat and add the vinegar, which is going to be that acid which is going to change the physical characteristics of the milk itself. We're going to start to see a curd which is going to separate from the whey after stirring for 1 minute to 2 minutes. We're going to have it covered and let it sit for 30 minutes. Next, we're going to line a colander with a cheesecloth. If you don't have a cheesecloth like me, you might just use a very clean tea towel. You can wash the tea towel with soap and don't use any fabric softener with it. You can dry it and then line the colander and pour the mixture over, letting it drain for 5 minutes. And a little tip and trick, you can personalize your cottage cheese by adding other flavorings such as herbs, fruits, or even syrups that make it a little bit sweet. So let's continue to talk about making cottage cheese. We want you to gather the ends of the cloth tightly into a ball and then run it through cold water while kneading and squeezing that ball to cool it. Once it's cooled, squeeze as much water as possible and transfer to a mixing bowl. You're then going to break up the curds using a spoon and add some salt for flavor if needed. If served immediately, add the half and half or heavy cream. If not, you can store the curds in an airtight container and add either the half and half or heavy cream just before serving. So let's review the recipe and talk about the science behind it. Why are we adding the vinegar to the milk? Well, as a reminder, we want to make sure that we have some acid. So in industrial cheese production, we have these lactic acid bacteria and or enzymes such as rennet, which are added to the milk that help curdle it. The lactic acid bacteria and rennet produce acid, or they are an acid, and they lower the pH around 4.6, which is what we call the casein isoelectric point, or more or less the point in which it's going to start to curdle. By adding vinegar to this recipe, we're aiming to make the casein reach its isoelectric point and allow that solid curd to form so that we can enjoy it as more of a cheese rather than a liquid milk. What type of cheese is cottage cheese? Well, one way that we can classify it is as a fresh cheese, which means it has a moisture content of 40 to 80% and it is not aged. But when we're talking about other cheeses, we want some microbes to help give them their distinctive flavor. For example, we have these groups of microbes called lactobacilli, and they're often used to start cheese cultures. They're also providing an additional benefit of being a natural preservative. This is especially important in current times as many of the unnatural preservatives are being revealed to be harmful to people. The possibility for lactobacilli to be used as a natural preservative provides much needed alternatives for those individuals who are interested in keeping things as natural as possible. And lactobacillus does this through the production of organic acids. If they drop the pH, it's harder for pathogens to grow in that cheese itself. We also have other microbes that have roles in cheese making. Cheese is very much alive when you think of the classic cheeses like the blue cheese, the cheddar cheese, and the Swiss cheese. The cheese making process is combining milk with the starter culture and specific microbes for the type of cheese that's being made. It's almost like wine, where you have specific grapes as well as specific microorganisms that are used to allow for that fermentation to take place. Cheese is very, very similar. Bacteria's nature is to compete and cooperate with other bacteria, which is going to allow the cheese to take on its fabulous characteristics. The level of bacteria, yeast, and mold present help change the flavor and leads to the final production of a cheese itself. And we have some factors that affect that bacterial growth during the cheese-making process. So things like the milk composition, the temperature, the moisture level, pH, the size of the curd particles at cutting, stirring rates, and levels of salt all are going to have effects on the final product. Microbes can have very good relationships with cheese, and then some might be trying to destroy your cheese. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So the starter culture, we're using it to help convert that lactose, which is the sugar that's in milk, to a lactic acid, which is going to bring down the pH of the product itself. The microbes in the starter help change the environment and help change the pH for future microbes to grow. This is going to enhance the flavor and taste of the cheese itself. And we want you to be careful of eating cheese that has a high pH and high moisture content, especially if you've had it out for a long time. So the microbes that would grow in this picture that you see on our slide are not the desirable microbes we're talking about. The type of environment that has a high pH and moisture content supports the growth of bad bacteria like Listeria. A couple fun facts about cheese. Each piece of cheese that we eat may contain as many as 10 billion microbes. Another fun fact, microbes can change the flavor, smell, color, and texture of the cheese you're eating. As we discussed earlier, one step in the cheese-making process is the conversion of lactose to lactic acid. First, we're going to take the lactose, which is a disaccharide, meaning that we have two monosaccharides linked together. We're then going to break it into its two component monosaccharides, glucose and galactose. We're going to be using the enzyme lactase to do that. So on the image, you might see the orange and the blue linked together. If they're linked together, that's the disaccharide lactose. If the link is broken, we have that glucose and galactose, the individual monosaccharides. Those individual monosaccharides then are going to be fermented, and through the fermentation process, we are producing lactic acid. Because we're producing lactic acid, which is an acid, it causes the cheese to become acidic and the pH to drop, which leads to the next few steps associated with that cheese making process. So next we're going to take and we are going to introduce something like rennet. Simply put, rennet is a group of enzymes that can come from the inside of a cow's stomach. The enzymes that it is composed of are proteases and lipases. So the proteases are going to be breaking down peptide bonds. So peptides are going to be individual amino acids that are linked together with those peptide bonds, and the proteases break that peptide bond to release individual amino acids or smaller chains of amino acids. We also have lipases, and lipases are going to break the bonds between glycerol and fatty acids that are present in triglycerides. So here you can see the glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids, and what we're going to do is we're going to digest or break the bond between those fatty acids and the glycerol backbone to release the glycerol and fatty acids. This actually changes the characteristics of the cheese, making it more desirable. Next, we want to make the milk proteins solid. No one likes a liquid cheese. That would be called something like yogurt, or it might be called something like milk. So ultimately, we want a solid cheese. And to do this, we want that acid present. Like I said, lactic acid or the addition of acid is going to allow that to happen. We also want to break some bonds between amino acids. So we want to break those peptide bonds. And then what happens is we can have these casein micelles which stick together, making a nice solid clump itself. We're coming full circle with cheese's microbial activity. And let me introduce to you some microbes associated with the production of cottage cheese, Swiss cheese, cheddar cheese, and blue cheese. You do not have to memorize all the different bacteria that are associated with the production of these different cheeses, but notice some similarities as you glance at this slide. Notice some differences, and keep in mind the flavors associated with these different cheese profiles. We've also got some classic chemical elements associated with cheese. So cheese has similar components as its main source or its main ingredient, milk. It's rich in minerals as well as macronutrients, carbohydrate, lipid, and we are going to have some proteins too. The major types of protein are going to be casein. Like I said, that's going to be the solid protein, and we also have the whey. Lactose is converted to lactic acid in the cheese production. And when this happens, the proteins in the milk start to curdle. The casein protein coagulates. And we have some essential nutrients and non-essential components. When we look at the essential nutrients in cheese, it does have a very high quality protein. It may have some remnants of carbohydrates like lactose. We have vitamins like vitamin A and B12. We've got minerals like sodium, potassium, and zinc. And we have some non-essential components. We don't need to consume saturated fatty acids or cholesterol, but let me tell you, the saturated fatty acids do make the cheese a little bit more delicious. So when we look at nutrition facts panels comparing cottage cheese and cheddar cheese, what do you find when we're comparing 100 grams of cottage cheese to 100 grams of cheddar cheese? If you recall from our previous discussion, cottage cheese is going to have a lot more moisture to it. So if you take the 100 grams and you subtract out the total fat, total carbohydrate, and total protein, you'll notice it has a large percentage of its weight that's coming from water. Comparatively, the cheddar cheese is much drier. It's going to be more concentrated a cheese. So therefore, the cheddar cheese has more calories per gram compared to the cottage cheese. Cheddar cheese also contains more cholesterol, but less sugar than the cottage cheese, which makes sense because, again, the cheddar cheese is more concentrated, but it also has been fermented. And through that fermentation process, the lactose has been reduced significantly because the bacteria have eaten it up to produce that lactic acid. The cheddar cheese contains more calcium and sodium per gram than cottage cheese as well. If we're comparing Swiss cheese and blue cheese, what are some differences? Again, we're comparing a 100-gram portion just so you can visually see the difference between the two. The Swiss cheese and the blue cheese have similar caloric values and fat content. The blue cheese contains more sodium and potassium compared to Swiss cheese. And that sodium gives that blue cheese a little bit more of, again, a bite to it when you put it on salads or on steak or something else. So you need less blue cheese to give it a lot of flavor. The Swiss cheese contains more calcium compared to that blue cheese. When we look at the macronutrient breakdown of cheese, we have the total calories at 230. Cheddar cheese has carbohydrates at 1.8 grams. And if we multiply those 1.8 grams by 4 calories per gram, we get 7.2 carbohydrate calories. If we're looking at the fat content, we've got about 18.8 grams of fat per 56 gram serving, and we multiply that by 9 calories per gram, and that gives you 169.2 calories from fat itself. We also have protein at 13 grams per serving, and then if we multiply that out by 4 calories per gram, that gives us 52 protein calories. So if you're looking at the breakdown on the right-hand side here, you can see that even though people might think of cheese as something that's a very high protein snack, you'll notice that in reality, it actually has a lot of fat in it, at 74% of the calories coming from fat, comparatively to 23% of the calories coming from protein, and a mere 3% of the calories coming from carbohydrates. If we're going to digest this cheese, because it's mostly made of fat, let's talk about its fat or lipid digestion. In the mouth, even though we do have linguinal lipase in our saliva, very little actual digestion happens here. The cheese is only in the mouth for a short period of time. In the stomach, because we have a little bit of gastric lipase and we have a little bit of an emulsifier, we have a little more digestion in the stomach. However, if we move on to the small intestine, this is where the majority of the digestion occurs. We've got our bile from the liver, which is going to be secreted into the small intestine, allowing for ample emulsification. The cheese is going to be in the small intestine for a significant amount of time, so we've got a lot of digestion via pancreatic lipase, breaking down the triglycerides to diglycerides or monoglycerides and glycerol, as well as free fatty acids. The micelles are then going to transport the contents through the enterocytes, which are a fancy word for small intestinal cells, which allow things to enter into the body, and then they're going to become part of our body itself. So next, let's discuss absorption. Cheese is known for its calcium. we have some efficient absorption of calcium, more efficient than calcium that we would have from plant products. Overall, calcium retention is increased through the consumption of foods like cheese. We also have an increase in phosphorus retention in the body when we're consuming foods like cheese. And even though our calcium and phosphorus are going to be very healthful and absorbed very well with a high bioavailability compared to other food products, our iron utilization is not as good. So ultimately, we're going to have a decrease in iron utilization comparatively to some other foods like something like ground beef or even pinto beans. Depending upon the cheese hardness, this may actually impact digestion as well as absorption. It makes sense that the harder the cheese is, in general, the higher the calcium content. The harder the cheese also, the slower the absorption rate. And depending upon the cheese, we have different moisture contents. So during the processing of many cheeses, water content is reduced when it's pressed to remove the whey and extra water from that product itself. Milk from a cow has a water content of 87.5% by comparison, compared to cheddar cheese, which has a moisture content of about 35 to 38%. Less water is removed from softer cheeses such as cottage cheese, which is why it's not going to stick in that block. We actually have to have it in a container. And the removal of water causes the nutrients in milk to become 10 times more concentrated on average on some of our harder cheeses themselves. But when we talk about water, we need to talk about water activity as well. Like we had mentioned before, water activity is very important in food safety as it relates to the microbial growth as well as the cheese shelf life. The higher the water activity generally corresponds to higher possibility of microbial growth and a shorter shelf life. Water activity in cheese is extremely high. Cottage cheese has a water activity of 0.988 and cheddar cheese has a water activity of 0.950. Very soft cheeses like our cottage cheese tend to have shorter shelf lives due to high water activity. So once you open that cheddar cheese container, it's going to last longer than if you open a cottage cheese container. So again, the higher the percent water, the shorter the shelf life. It's an inverse proportion. When we look at health implications, cheese is often nutrient dense, providing protein, minerals, and vitamins. It can aid in bone density, helping assist with a decrease in risk for fractures. It can also have high levels of sodium. This one's not as good. With high levels of sodium, that may increase our risk for hypertension. Cheese also has high levels of saturated fat, which is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. However, recent studies have shown that saturated fatty acids from dairy sources can potentially have healthier impacts on our bodies than other sources of saturated fatty acids, such as a steak. And while we should limit the amount of food with saturated fats that we consume, there are some benefits to consuming cheese. But not everyone can enjoy a big bowl of cottage cheese. Some people struggle with lactose intolerance. Because cheese contains the dietary sugar lactose, which is a disaccharide, you need to digest it prior to absorbing the two monosaccharides that make it up. Those who are deficient in the enzyme lactase cannot properly digest the bonds in the lactose. So therefore, we're never releasing that galactose and glucose for direct absorption into the bloodstream. So if we have lactose, it's a disaccharide that goes from the small intestine to the large intestine where our bacteria live, and the bacteria in the large intestine love when sugar comes into the large intestine, and it's actually going to cause fermentation of that lactose. The fermentation can cause things like bloating, not fun, gas, which isn't fun for your friends or neighbors, and even a little more uncomfortable, diarrhea. So let's learn about the history of lactose intolerance. Cheese making seems to have emerged, again, 7,000 plus years ago, which is 500 years after milk started being stored. This dates back to individuals who were in Dalmatia, which is modern-day Croatia. This estimation is based off of chemical analysis of ceramic shards found in archaeological sites. It's kind of cool. However, the Dalmatian people did not have the gene for lactose tolerance, so this cheese and milk was only for young children who still had the ability to break down the sugar. Later, because of genetic changes, as well as individuals being nomadic and having children with people from other parts of the globe, the gene became active in select populations, allowing for the production of lactase in adult small intestinal cells, therefore the breakdown of lactose, and with some individuals being able to enjoy cheese and milk into their later years. Even more scary, though, are individuals who struggle with a dairy allergy. An allergy is most common found in early childhood. We have immune responses against milk proteins, and some common symptoms associated with a dairy allergy might be vomiting, diarrhea, hives or rashes, wheezing, eczema, and anaphylaxis. And with anaphylaxis, it can even cause death. So what is the future of cheese? We want to make cheese and we want to make it faster. So we want to accelerate the aging of cheese. So we want to develop faster aging cheeses to help up with the demand. And we can do this by altering several different variables, such as adding more enzymes, manipulating adjunct cultures, having genetic modification of the starter culture, higher ripening temperature. All of these will help accelerate the aging of the cheese. We also have plant-based cheeses in our future. We're switching to these non-dairy cheeses for a variety of reasons. As seen with beef, there's been a shift towards these products. However, plant-based cheese is experiencing more roadblocks than other plant-based products, including plant-based dairy. Currently, plant-based cheese lacks the same stretchability and melt that animal cheese might have, so people aren't accepting it as readily. But food scientists are on it and changes are on the way. As you study this module, let us know if you have any questions. It's an exciting topic and we'd love to discuss it with you either in person or through our virtual tutoring center.